Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons. Today, we are doing one of our quick builds where we'll be exploring a briefly summarized character build for Dungeons & Dragons. And as always with our quick builds, if there's ever a build you'd like to see me explore in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. The concept for today's build comes from Open World Addict, who asked to see a Ranged Monk build with a cross between the Kensei Monk and the Swarmkeeper Ranger. The bow was the preference of weapon for this build, and I'm going to take that to mean short bow or long bow. And as far as rule set goes, I did check back, and 2024 is the way to go since 2024 monks have a pretty good improvement over the 2014 monk. Now overall, this is a pretty straightforward concept and should be a fairly simple build. We already know what both of our subclasses are going to be. It's just a matter of what feats, what level breakdown, and those sorts of things that we really need to figure out. Now, the one thing to talk about is, like I said, there's a longbow or a short bow that are the two main weapons I'm considering to be bows. The build as presented here is going to use the longbow for one main reason and one reason only, and that is Great Weapon Master. Great Weapon Master adds damage to the longbow that the short bow just doesn't get. Now don't let that deter you. The short bow is still a very valid option, and in fact, monks are proficient with short bows but aren't proficient with long bows, so we're going to have to do a little bit of gaming there to try and make the build work a little bit easier. Even though I am presenting the build with a longbow in mind, I will probably try to highlight some key areas where the short bow would get a unique benefit, pick something different than the longbow would. That way, if you wanted to use a short bow, it's still a perfectly viable option. So without any further ado, let's jump into the build. Starting in character creation with our origin, we are going to be a human. At least I'm going to be a human simply because I'm fairly plain and I like the extra origin feat that we get right off the bat. Any lineage should be able to work though, so you could feel free to play any other lineage you wanted to. And here's where our first short bow change comes into play. If you were serious about using the short bow instead of the long bow, I would highly recommend Elf as your lineage because the short bow has the Vex Weapon Mastery, which basically gives you on-demand advantage against a single target. It takes a little bit of setup, but that's essentially what it does. And that can pair really well with Elven Accuracy, which is something we're not actually going to be going out of our way to pick up in the longbow build, but it would be a really good option to pick up with a short bow, and it could increase your damage that way as well. As far as our background goes, Sailor from the 2024 Player's Handbook actually gives us exactly what we want. It gives us the Tavern Brawler origin feat, which is definitely an origin feat we want to pick up. And it also gives us an increase to dexterity and wisdom, which are the two ability scores that we want to improve. The real question is just whether or not a ranged bow monk really feels like a sailor to you. If they don't, then honestly pick a different background from a previous book and pick any origin feat you want to start off with, and then increase your dexterity by 2 and your wisdom by 1, which is exactly what we would be doing anyways with the sailor background. As far as our human origin feat goes, I'm going to go with tough because our constitution isn't going to give us that much health, and tough is a nice way to increase our durability, though you could pick any other origin feat that you wanted. Finally, we have our stats, and after point buy, we're going to want the following array of ability scores. Strength is going to be 13 after we put 5 points into it. We're going to put 9 points into dexterity, as well as our +2, like I said, to get it up to 17. We're going to put 7 points into constitution to get it to 14. We're going to put 1 point into intelligence to push it up to 9, but it's not going to be too important for us. And then we're going to put our last 5 points and a +1 into wisdom to get our wisdom to 14, while leaving our charisma alone at 8. And with all that said, now it's time to jump into the build. Starting with our level breakdown, we're going to look at each tier of play like we do with all 2024 builds. And the first tier is tier 1, levels 1 to 5. For these levels, we're going to be a Ranger 1 and a Monk 4. I'm going to say we start as a Ranger for the extra little bit of hit points from the bigger hit die, as well as weapon masteries, which we get right away, and of course, proficiency in the longbow, which is something that the Monk does not get. One other thing we get is Favored Enemy, or Hunter's Mark. Hunter's Mark is a bit of a contentious issue in the 2024 rules. I'm sure you've heard a lot of other channels talk about this design choice, and it's not something I really want to focus on, but just know that for the sake of our build, since we're not going to go too far into Ranger, those free castings of Hunter's Mark, plus the spell slots that we get right away at Ranger 1 now in 2024, are going to be some nice boosts for our damage. The other thing we get from being a monk now are, of course, martial arts, focus points, which kind of replace key points, though anything that used to reference a key point now references a focus point. We get our subclass, which we know is going to be Kensei Monk, and we also get our first feat. Our first feat is definitely going to be Sharpshooter. That way we can shoot at far range and in melee if an enemy gets close to us. Kensei Monk allows us to make a longbow a Kensei weapon, and that will allow us to then use Kensei Shot as a bonus action to increase our damage while we're at range as well. The one thing to now talk about is monk weapons. Just like in 2014, bows are not monk weapons. A monk is proficient in all simple weapons and martial weapons that have the light property, but that does not mean that the longbow or even the short bow are monk weapons. Monk weapons are still melee weapons specifically. Now 2014 had a little bit of a way around this for some weapons through the Tasha's Cauldron of Everything optional feature, Dedicated Weapon. That, however, unless your DM is generous, no longer exists. So we'll have to find a way around using a non-monk weapon for most of the time in order to actually still use our martial arts features. Because keep in mind, as long as we have our longbow equipped and in our hands, we cannot use the bonus action martial arts unarmed strike. Our martial arts weapon die does not scale for our unarmed strikes, and we can't even use dexterity for our unarmed strikes while we have the bow in hand. Luckily, this was more of an issue in 2014 than it is in 2024, because we have a specific gameplay loop to get around it. This gameplay loop comes from the rules under the attack action in the 2024 rules glossary. The attack action has rules on equipping and unequipping weapons, and to summarize, what it says is that when we take the attack action, before or after we make an attack as part of that action, we can equip or unequip a weapon. This means that if we want to be a true bow monk and use both our martial arts features as well as our bow, we're going to have to do a bit of weapon juggling and use these rules. So our gameplay loop pretty much looks like this. If we're able to stay at range, that's fine. We use Kensei Shot, shoot our longbow, that's it. If an enemy rushes into melee with us and they're within 5 feet and we don't have Sharpshooter yet, we're going to take the attack action, stow our longbow if we have it out, and then make our unarmed strike as part of the attack action. We can then follow it up with our bonus action, unarmed strike, or spend a focus point to do flurry of blows. One thing to note is that we could technically use flurry of blows while we have our longbow out, because it's not part of the martial arts feature. However, it would be significantly underpowered given that we would not get the scaling martial arts die and we would have to use strength. So for now, we have to keep swapping out our bow. All in all, it is a pretty seamless gameplay loop. It's just unfortunate that it has to technically be done in order to get around using martial arts with a bow rules as written. If your DM's generous, maybe they'll just hand wave it and let you do all these actions while you have your bow out, because that would be pretty cool. Otherwise, we're not just going to be shooting our bow from far away as a monk, we're going to be doing a bunch of acrobatics and martial arts moves while equipping and unequipping our bow throughout combat. And now it's time to talk about Tier 2. Tier 2 is levels 6 to 10, and here we're going to be a Monk 7 and Ranger 3. There are 3 key things we want to talk about here. Number 1 is extra attack and archery. We only gain the archery fighting style when we go up to Ranger 2, and not earlier than that. It's going to come down to a choice for you to make as to whether you want to have extra attack first or the archery fighting style first. The other things to talk about are Stunning Strike and Deft Strike. Stunning Strike has had a major change. It is now only once per turn that we can use it. It only costs 1 focus point still, and if an enemy should succeed on their saving throw, instead of just having nothing happen, they will now have their speed reduced by half, and the next attack against them before the start of our next turn has advantage. That is still a pretty debilitating debuff, and even though we cannot use Stunning Strike with our bow, we have to do an unarmed strike or use a monk weapon in order to do Stunning Strike. What we could do is either get into melee, or if we're already in melee with an enemy, we could shoot them with our longbow, apply the slow weapon mastery that the longbow has, and then unequip it, use our bonus action to do an unarmed strike or flurry of blows, and apply Stunning Strike to one of those attacks. If they fail, they are now stunned. That's great. If they succeed, their speed is now cut down by half, as well as -10 due to the longbow's slow weapon mastery. That adds a nice amount of control for our monk, but also it gives us the option to shoot a different enemy with our longbow and slow them while punching the enemy in front of us and using Stunning Strike on them to slow two enemies, one by half and one by 10 feet. The other strike option to talk about is Deft Strike, and if we are able to stay at range consistently throughout most combats, this is what we're probably using our focus points on. Deft Strike allows us to spend a focus point in order to roll an extra damage die equal to our martial arts die. Martial arts dice now scale a lot faster than they did in 2014. Instead of starting at a D4 and going to a D10, they now start at a D6 and go to a D12. So right away when we get this feature, it's actually already a D8, meaning that we can just have an on-demand critical hit with our longbow whenever we want to spend the focus point. And if we want to save the focus point until we actually roll a real critical hit, we're going to get even more damage out of this feature. It's a nice little shadow buff that was probably not super intentional, but we're happy to have it anyways. At tier 3, we are now a Monk 12 and Ranger 3, and here is where we're going to talk about Great Weapon Master. We could have picked it up sooner, that much is true, by going Ranger 4 or Monk 8, but I felt jumping between the two was a little bit nicer since also at Ranger 3, which I didn't talk about, we got our Swarmkeeper subclass. To quickly talk about Great Weapon Master, since it's a very straightforward feature, it gives us a boost to our strength, which we don't really need, but it lets us add our proficiency bonus to the damage we deal with our longbow, and that's on every attack we make with it with the attack action. That really adds up, even though we only have 2 shots with our longbow. It's still a very nice bonus to have, and can technically let us outpace a short bow with elven accuracy, at least against enemies with lower armor classes. For Swarmkeeper, there isn't too much to talk about. It gives us a few nice features like Swarmkeeper Magic and Gathered Swarm, but we're honestly not going that much further down into Ranger because none of the other features really boost us enough to merit going further into Ranger. Gathered Swarm is really our key ability. It says that once per turn after we hit an enemy, we can cause the swarm to either deal 1d6 piercing damage, or we can get moved by the swarm horizontally 5 feet in a direction of our choice. That's not too bad. Or we could do a 15-foot push, but the enemy has to make a strength save when we hit them with an attack. This can be really nice added on to the other control we have from our longbow. You pair that with the slow mastery, and you would be potentially pushing an enemy 15 feet in a horizontal direction and then slowing them by 10 feet. That's a nice little combo. An even better combo is pairing it with Stunning Strike. Because we don't need to use a weapon to do Gathered Swarm, if we hit an enemy with our unarmed strike, use Stunning Strike, and if they succeed on their saving throw, their speed is now halved and they're getting pushed 15 feet away. A really big speed debuff. But if they do fail their saving throw and become stunned, the stun condition says that they automatically fail all strength saves, meaning we don't even have to worry about pushing them, we just can. Shove them back for free for 15 feet, and they will be stunned out in the middle of nowhere. We also do get some really nice extra monk features that are higher level as well, including Heightened Focus, which has a bunch of buffs to our Patient Defense, Step of the Wind, and Flurry of Blows features, such as being able to make 3 attacks with Flurry of Blows instead of just 2. That's all very nice to see as well. Finally, it's time for tier 4, and that is Monk 16 and Ranger 4. There's not too much to talk about at this level. We get more of the new monk features like perfect focus, so we have more key points technically. We have deflect energy, we have discipline survivor, and we also have picked up by now the sharpen the blade Kensei feature to make our longbow a magic weapon if we haven't already picked up a magic weapon. Also, if you've noticed, I saved Ranger 4 till now because, as it has been pointed out a few times, if we do a multi-class like this, where we reach the ability score improvement / feat level at level 19, and then follow it up with another one at level 20, we can actually pick up 2 epic boons. And that's exactly what we're going to do. You can pick your favorite 2 epic boons, the prerequisites of which are only that we are level 19. So at level 19, we grab 1, at level 20, we grab another one, and that's pretty much it. And other than that, that's the build. Overall, we are a ranged monk build for sure. It's just that we are a lot more monk than ranger. We really don't need that many levels of ranger for this build though. In 2014, a more even split, or maybe even going more ranger, would probably have been appropriate, because monk just didn't give us that many cool abilities. Now in 2024, it does. And quite frankly, ranger doesn't give us that much, or at least Swarmkeeper doesn't. Swarmkeeper gives us Gathering Swarm at level 3 when we take the subclass, and that's really the bread and butter we want from our Swarmkeeper Ranger dip. To go any further into it would require us to pick up Writhing Tide at level 7, which we just straight up don't need. It's a fly speed of 10 feet that allows us to hover. We're so much faster than that with unarmored movement, there's really no need for us to pick this up at all. As well, the 11th level feature Mighty Swarm doesn't give us enough control or damage boosts in order to really merit going that far into Ranger. We get a lot more out of being a monk than we do out of trying to get Mighty Swarm. So really, just 4 levels of Ranger for Gathering Swarm and the extra epic boon is all we really need. Now, one last thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and I'll try to make this quick, is that there are other ranged monks that could arguably be a better build. And those are monks that use thrown weapons. Daggers and light hammers are also simple melee weapons, so they for sure are monk weapons. They also have the nick property, so they just give us a flat out extra attack, and normally their weapon die would be a d4. We know that thanks to martial arts scaling better, they're already on par with other martial weapons right away. The real kicker though on why a thrown weapon build for a monk could be so good is because of Stunning Strike. Stunning Strike is no longer melee dependent, it's just that you have to use an unarmed strike or a monk weapon to activate it. Since monk weapons are specifically melee weapons, normally this means that you're using Stunning Strike in melee. But technically, you can use a thrown weapon to get around this, meaning we could use Stunning Strike from range. We would also want to swap out the archery fighting style for the thrown weapon fighting style, but given that we have an extra attack from Nick, that's just a fair amount of extra bonus damage, which is pretty nice. The main caveat and why I say this is arguably a better ranged build is because of the fact that our range with thrown weapons is significantly smaller than with a bow. So it would really be more of a skirmisher build than a ranged build, but it's still something to think about. But if you were looking for a tried and true ranged build who can mix it up at extreme ranges while also not being afraid to get into melee, the Bow Monk is the way to go. Let me know what you thought of the build or what you would add or change to get closer to the concept of the Bow Monk, and let me know if you would go with longbow or short bow, and which you would prefer to use. Or if you would actually try to make a crossbow work as well, since that is probably viable. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.